The belief that ancient Kemet was colonized and ruled by indigenous Africans was a view commonly held by Greek travelers to Egypt thousands of years ago. According to John G. Jackson, author of Introduction to African Civilizations, he stated, "It may be of interest to the reader to know that the ancient Egyptians did not call themselves Egyptians. The name was invented by the Greeks. The first Greek visitors to Egypt in the 7th century BC were greatly impressed by the temple of Ptah at Memphis. They regarded it as the grandest structure in the Nile Valley, and they afterward referred to this ancient land as He-Ka-Ptah, the land of the temple of Ptah. In the Greek language, He-Ka-Ptah becomes Aegyptos, and under the Roman rule, the name was Latinized into Aegyptus, from which we get the name Egypt." The Greeks were also responsible for a multitude of etymological atrocities. They changed the name of Asar to Osiris, Aset to Isis, and Heru to Horus. This Nile Valley family was not only the prototype of the Holy Trinity, but Aset and Heru also represent the first images of the Madonna and Child. The Greeks worshipped Isis and Horus, and the Romans later knew them as the Black Madonna and Child. As the centuries passed, references to their black skin passed as they began to be portrayed as Caucasian. The Greeks also changed the names of the builders of the 3 main pyramids at Giza. They called Khufu Cheops. His son Khafre was called Chephren, and his son Menkaure was called Mycerinus. The early kings of Kemet never called themselves Pharaoh. That word was introduced into the language by foreigners during the New Kingdom almost 2,000 years after Narmer unified the 2 lands of ancient Kemet. Homer, the first Greek author of note, wrote in the Iliad that Zeus and all of the gods of Greece traveled to the Nile Valley to dine with the faultless men of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also a word of Greek origin. It comes from the words ethos, which means burnt, and opes, which means face. Ethos and opes becomes Ethiopian, a descriptive adjective which literally means burnt face and describes the skin color of the people that the Greeks found in the Nile Valley. Herodotus, the Greek father of history, described the Egyptians as black skin with woolly hair. Herodotus also declared that almost all of the names of the gods came into Greece from Egypt. In the mid-1790s, a Frenchman named Count Constantine de Valny published a book entitled The Ruins of Empires, which chronicled his travels to Egypt between 1783 and 1785. Valny's book became an instant bestseller in France and was soon translated into English. Shortly thereafter, an American edition appeared for sale in the United States. But since Africans were still being enslaved in America at that time, the publishers decided to delete segments of the text that might be considered offensive to European Americans.
Nefertiti. Assumed that it was Nefertiti. So this image was doctored up, and I want to show you how to identify the fact that this is the original image of Nefertiti. You see here a crack that runs down the entire crown, runs past the ear, which explains why the ear is damaged. It also extends down beneath her neck, which means that this statue was originally broken into at least 3 different pieces. You see here a gash above her eyebrow. You see here a hole in her ear where an earring once was. This is the original bust of Nefertiti. Now, sisters and brothers, what the Germans did is the same thing that the French have done, the same thing that the English have done. Whenever they find something that's a little bit too black, they'll take it in the back room and they'll doctor it up. The ear. This is a copy. But also what they did in making this copy was to lighten the skin and then make the nose and the lips smaller than the original. So we have to understand what has been happening to our history, to our culture, and to our images over thousands of years. Next slide.
These processes go something like this, that in order for one group of people, in this case Europeans, to control an African population, it was necessary first to erase African memory. Secondly, to suppress the practice of African culture. Third, to teach white supremacy. Fourth, to control the institution of socialization, to prevent African people from educating their own children, from sending their own messages and so forth through media and what have you. The control of wealth, and finally, physical segregation. These are the historical activities that Europeans engaged in order to conquer the continent, to enslave people, to practice segregation. And of course, if you look closely at that list, you'll notice that the first few things on the list are really psychological. For example, to destroy memory or to suppress or erase memory is a psychological operation which disables anyone as an individual who had no memory.
Now, when you say memory, you're talking about personal memory or what?
I mean the memory of one's group history in particular. Personal memory would be important if we're talking about your own psychological individual adaptation. But you can use the same thinking to apply to a group. When a group loses its historical memory, it is disabled as a result. So these were some of the very calculated and conscious tactics that were applied that resulted in the disabling of the African population. So history, identity, the teaching a belief in white supremacy, each of these is a psychological process that was practiced, and we need to understand that in part by going back and examining the historical record. And having understood it, it's possible to gain control over those things that control us.
Future presentation, Africa's Missing Noses. And finally, this one of Jesus the Christ. This one is called Christ in Glory, painted black. As far as I know, this is the earliest known depiction of Jesus in existence. This is in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. You see an image of Jesus emerging from his tomb after the crucifixion. If you look very closely, you can see blood in his hands where he was nailed to the cross. Also on his feet, which are not portrayed in this image. And you can see 11 of his disciples. The one pointing to Christ's side is St. Thomas, who we call Doubting Thomas. And here you can find Jesus with a natural hair.
Africans in an ancient land that they called Kemet were the first to construct obelisks of solid granite over 170 feet high. They were religious and scientific instruments. The obelisk could be used to determine the meridian for astronomical calculations and as an accurate shadow clock. An African-born mathematician named Eratosthenes used an obelisk in Kemet to determine the radius and circumference of the Earth. Here's how it could be done. By measuring the shadow of an obelisk of known height, the angle of the sun can be determined. Then, traveling a known distance and measuring when the sun is directly overhead, as evidenced by the absence of shadow, suggests that proportion which can be easily solved for the radius and circumference of the Earth. This milestone in history demonstrates that African technology was advanced and thorough enough to prove the Earth was round long before Columbus made his voyage. Good evening. I'm now
Egypt until 640. The first non-African people came to Egypt, otherwise called the Hyksos, in 1675 BC. The Africans there were already in the 13th dynasty period. They had built every pyramid you saw there before. They had done the S-turn in the Nile. They built every one of the major temples that had already been built, including the Grand Lodge of Luxor. The first European to come there did not arrive until the Greeks arrived with Alexander II, the son of Philip of Macedonia.
Look, I'm a college graduate. I never heard all this stuff before.
Because they didn't intend to teach you that. They can't tell you that you're inferior and teach you that you taught Europe. The first Europeans to be civilized by the Africans were the Greeks. When you heard of Homer, the first European to have written anything, you couldn't miss that. They said that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that was not until 833 BC. The Africans had already, in 255,000 at the Tassili Mountain, they had the Sibyllian period, first, second, and third, the pre-dynastic period, all the way up. The Africans had produced men like this, Imhotep, the multi-genius that designed the step pyramid of Saqqara, the first man to be a physician that even Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, is giving him credit and call him the god of medicine. The Greeks changed his name from Imhotep to Aesculapius. There he is. There he is.
Wait a minute.
It's in the documents of the church. And it's in the writing of the church. And was it not Pope Melchizedek, the three African popes of the Roman Catholic Church, Melchizedek, Victor III, and the other one?
Galatius.
Pope Galatius. Galatius. We have them there. Now, these are church documents. But remember, when there came a time in 1506, after we lost power in Spain, the Africans ruled Spain from 711. We were calling ourselves Moors, M-A-U-E-R-S, then M-O-O-R-S. From 711 until 1485, 774 years, when we built and brought into Europe the university system, building the University of Salamanca, S-A-L-A-M-A-N-C-A in Spain, a copy of the University of Genève from ancient Ghana, which was equally a copy of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which the French later called Timbuktu. Now, look, if you want to read it, read Stanley Lane Poole's The Moors in Spain, written in 1887, or Alejandro Macaziza. Read his book in Spanish, The Moors in Spain, and said that even the bath was introduced by those Africans.
You said the bra was introduced by...
The bath was reintroduced because Rome had a bath before, but they stopped because of not understanding the Christian doctrine that the Europeans had embraced. They stopped for over 1,000 years from taking baths. As a matter of fact, I'd like to make mockery of the fact that the Queen Victoria of England boasting of herself being the cleanest woman in all of Europe, taking one bath per month.
Went to Egypt to school.
As a matter of fact, the Egyptians said Homer was Egyptian, not Greek.
That's right. It's only the Europeans said that. The Westerners now said that he was. But let us go back. Remember that Homer himself said in the Odyssey what? That the gods Zeus and Apollo, Europe's first gods, came from Ethiopia. Go read it. And I didn't write it. He wrote it. Thales, from Thales down to Socrates. And Socrates down to Aristotle, which they call the pre-Socratian philosophers and the post-Socratian philosophers, each and every one, including Plato, who spent 15 years in Egypt receiving their education.
You're saying Plato was educated in Egypt?
15 years.
Dr. John Henrik Clark is a living library of resources in this area.
We know that Ghana lasted until 1000s. In the last of its many great kings, Tenkameni was killed 2 years before the Muslim invasion, 1076. So that means Tenkameni lasted until 1074. He was known as the king who rode out every day, twice a day. He would ride out and administer justice one part of the day. And no one had to move from his presence until he was satisfied that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out at the end of the day with dogs with gold collars, horses better dressed than the then kings of Europe, in splendid regalia. And after Sakuru, the greatest of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa, and he came to power in 1306. In 1324, he went on a famous journey to Mecca and Medina because he was a Muslim. He spent all those years preparing. He took with him from 60 to 100,000 people, 50 hairdressers and he only had his favorite wives.
How many of
Only
them?
the favorite wives went on the trip. They had 50 hairdressers.
Oh,
so you can guess how many wives were there. Now you talking about style. Now when we had it, baby.
Okay, so he left basically from northern Central Africa, is that correct?
Yes.
And then went all the way into Mecca.
Went to Egypt. Went to Egypt first. Where he was crowned the great Caliph of the Western Sudan. I mean, it's equivalent to Pope.
Right.